So welcome to Homegrown in the Heart. This is a podcast where we discuss the issues of the day. We talk to people who are from the heart of Washington, that care about the heart of Washington, born and raised in the Yakima Valley. And these are game changers, people that make a difference in the world today. And today we're going to discuss just a host of issues that cover things from the pandemic and legal rights and responsibilities all the way to government dissension, division, and hopefully a path forward. What would Bill 2024 say to Bill 2019 about COVID? So the 2024 bill, having lived through COVID, would go back and say, first and foremost, buckle up, because you have no idea what's about to strike and the chaos that's going to erupt from that. And at the core of it, the chaos that erupts during a pandemic, and we've got recent history with COVID, is rooted so deeply in fear that you'll see division amongst people that you never would have thought division would happen. And it'll be division between family and friends and folks who were united pre-pandemic. Fell apart and division erupted during the pandemic. That's the first thing I would tell the 2024 Bill Pickett would tell the 2019 Bill Pickett. Buckle up, because this division's coming, and it's going to be rooted deeply in fear. The second thing I would tell myself back in 2019, based on what I know now, is that there is a path forward and a way through it, but it won't be by embracing fear. It'll be by embracing hope and doing your homework to understand fact from fiction, right? Because whenever there is any type of crisis that we face, and this is pandemic-wise or otherwise, and there's going to be a whole host of fact and fiction that will be mixed together, and you'll find yourself wondering what is true and what is not. And the only way to try to get through that is doing your own, to the very best of your ability, unbiased examination of what's really going on, and not easy to do, because none of us know if 90% of the things we're reading or researching or looking into, whether they're even accurate. So it's incredibly difficult. The third thing I would tell myself is, don't turn away from people in their time of need. Do not turn away from people. And one of the things that I was horribly disappointed in is during the pandemic, I saw a whole host of brothers and sisters in the legal profession turn their back on people, and primarily tracing that to fear. And so when people would want to know rights and responsibilities and how do we navigate through this legally, whether it be employers or employees in a pandemic world, right? How do we do that? Oftentimes I would find folks that really had sworn to serve people, and I'm specifically talking about lawyers here, turn their backs on people and not want to communicate, not want to offer advice, not want to meet with people and let them know that, one, here's the assurance we're going to get through this, and two, as we get through this, here's how to navigate this legally, ethically, and appropriately, right? And if we turn our backs, so I would tell myself back then, be prepared. You're going to have to embrace people, even in the midst of the chaos that says divide, separate, fracture. You're still going to have to embrace people in one form or another, so that people have the assurance that that all hell has not broken loose. It feels that way, but you can get through it if you will embrace each other and stay together, stay united, and follow the law. And you don't have to force the law. just tell people what the law is. That's at least one simple thing you can do to give people assurance. Because what does the law do for people in times of chaos and in times of uncertainty? It's to give assurance that we can count on certain things and we can plan our lives in certain ways, knowing that there's a reasonable probability that this is the way things are going to go. And one of the things that happened in the COVID situation and the pandemic is that all the rules changed. All the rules changed, and sometimes they changed overnight, just by whoever was in charge decided, here's what I'm going to tell you that the rule is today, and maybe tomorrow I'll change that and I'll tell you something different. That creates and fuels the already existing fear that people had in their life. So those are some of the things I would tell Bill Pickett in 2019 based on what I've been through and know in 2024. And I think the last thing I would say is COVID's strong. Pandemics are strong. Strong meaning that they have the ability to impact the way we feel. They have it has the ability to take life, right? It has the ability to change things. But this is more true. We, as a people, united, we are stronger. Okay? So a pandemic is strong, but people united are stronger, and we should never, ever forget that, because these things reoccur and they happen again. So those are the things I would tell myself. Probably the most important part for business owners is they have got to be in the midst of and we're talking in terms of pandemics, patient, okay, flexible in terms of how they operate, and be willing to persevere and maybe have to do things a little bit differently and not be afraid to do that. And also gather as much information as they can to operate as safely as they can, because nobody wants, no business owner wants an employee to be harmed on their watch. They want to conduct their business, but most of the people, I think, care about their employees. And in a upended situation like COVID, I think it's important to remain calm, be flexible, and be willing to explore other ways of doing business. And maybe not, and maybe that isn't necessary, but at least be curious and willing enough to look at other options to still conduct your business in the midst of mass fear and panic that's being generated as a result of a global pandemic. You're a business owner and you've got a government lockdown that shuts down your business. So you're in that all or nothing scenario there, right? If they're saying you're shut down, you can do one of two things. You can agree, shutter your business, and potentially go bankrupt, or you can refuse. You can refuse and say, I refuse to do that. Neither of them are good options. Neither of those are good options. That's why I go back to this concept of being curious enough to ask, okay, in the face of whatever government mandate or dictates coming my way, is there some way I can continue to function, be a law-abiding citizen, and still have a business? And if there is, explore it. Oftentimes, it's this is what I see with government mandates, and this doesn't matter if it's a pandemic, if it's COVID, or if it's this is the law in some subject area. Government makes a dictate, and people resist. It's human nature, and it go all the way back to the founding of this country, right? I mean, were we compliant and just wanting to pay our taxes and do whatever the king told us to do? No, we weren't. And that's why we were called rebels, right? And then we became not rebels, but founders of a great nation. And so I think there's a spirit in humanity oftentimes that says if you're going to be told to do something, it's a desire to resist. And that's not always bad. But before the resistance, I think oftentimes we should consider, is there a path that I can follow, that I can take, that is not outright resistance, but it's an effort to comply in good faith with whatever government entity is asking me to do something. Can I do that? And can I explore it? And can I succeed along that path before we go directly to resistance? Now, there are some things in this world that, if our government is telling us to do things that are just patently wrong, well, there's not I'm going to find a way to do it. If the government's telling me to put people in cages and kill them, right? Something that's an abomination. There's automatic resistance there. But oftentimes, when it comes to the gray areas and the fuzziness of how you operate in a certain setting, I think there's ways to work through that. Not always, but that's what we should first explore before resistance, right? So I was a sole practitioner in the midst of COVID, and that means I'm one lawyer. I have one assistant. We remoted for a short period of time, but the reality is I wasn't set up to switch to become a remote law firm. A lot of my colleagues were able to financially, and because of the nature of their practice, they were able to do that. So I still, throughout COVID, we remoted for a short period of time, then realized I had to be back in the office. So a lot of things, though, I was still able to do either telephonically, meeting with people. Zoom was another great resource that developed. So I was able to function, albeit, though, always combating the slowdowns and the disruption and the fear that came along with that pandemic, and the difficulty. Probably the most primarily the most difficult thing in my day-to-day practice is the courtroom appearances, right? Because I'm a trial attorney, you got to go to court, and there was a little shift with Zoom to assist in some of that. I'm not a huge fan, and everybody thinks differently of this, but Zoom trials. Not a big fan. I think there's something incredibly special about the coming into the sanctity of a courtroom to resolve our disputes that puts people in a different light, oftentimes puts people into their best behavior ever, and that's important. And so while I was able to sort of shift during the pandemic, it was extremely difficult, extremely challenging, but I was one person with my assistant who was very loyal and very capable, and we worked it out, but not without great difficulty. And I think the representation that clients got during COVID, it was harmed. It was harmed. A lot of people say, oh, no, I was a better lawyer on Zoom than I ever was in person or whatever. I don't know that I don't ascribe to that thinking. I think you're at your best when you're relating with other human beings in a very live and real environment. And so I think representation, for sure, representation of human beings was harmed by the sheer number of lawyers who were unwilling to continue to meet with people and to help them with their problems, primarily because of fear and panic that, well, that meeting could cost me or them or someone that I love their life. That greatly handicapped our ability to represent people, and it's a difficult chapter. And here's what I hope we learned something from it, but I'm not sure we did. The individual rights that were hampered, that were clamped down on during COVID, and courts, I think, during the pandemic, the legal system, it reacts so slowly. That's just the nature of the system. It's one of the worst vehicles to address crisis, right? So emergency rooms handle crisis, courtrooms, long-term projects. It's just a very different very different system. So now we've got, years after the fact, we've got courts now willing to examine the do's, the don'ts, the do's and don'ts, the rights, the wrongs, the rights that were impacted. And I think there are some, I can't quote them chapter and verse, but there are cases coming out where courts are vindicating employees' rights to refuse. The one that I just saw was the experimental vaccines, right, where they said it's not that the distinction they were making, if I remember this correctly, is that this was not life-saving. The injections were not life-saving. They ultimately were determined that they minimized the impacts of getting COVID. They didn't stop COVID, right? And so there was an opinion recently that came out, and I don't have the name of the case, but it said basically the court said, yeah, that wasn't this is going to stop COVID. You were forcing people to take injections that minimize symptoms. Maybe we think that's what it did, and that's like a therapeutic. It's not it's different than say giving was it polio or something that would prevent the disease. This just prevents or minimizes the symptoms or lessens the symptoms. And I think the courts are making these now finite distinctions. This is the point, finite distinctions. But guess what? Guess how long it took the courts to make those finite distinctions? Right, 5 years. Right, and here's the deal: courts operate that slowly. And the other thing that's super important is we want courts to operate slowly because we don't want them operating in a crisis. Because do people, including very smart judges, they're human beings too, are they going to operate at their highest, best level in the midst of a crisis? Or worse yet, if they're absolutely panicked and in fear for their own lives, that's when we want them to make those decisions? No, we don't. So I think the fact that it's taken so long to actually now go back and assess what did we do right and what did we do wrong, and did we, and I'm talking to the power brokers, whoever they may be, that got to make the decisions during that time of crisis. Did you do something wrong? Now it's being assessed, and hopefully the decisions that are being made will help us and assist us to look, now that things have settled down, as to how we would deal with this moving forward in the next crisis, and not if it ever happens, but when the next crisis happens, how we're going to handle it. I think it will be differently, hopefully. Hopefully it'll be better, but here's the problem there. If they only come around every, 50 to 100 years, and hope it's more than that, none of us will be here. But hopefully the opinions and the reforms that we've implemented, hopefully those will outlast us, and the next generation or generations out there will have a benefit of us having gone through that. I'm not an appellate lawyer, right? So I try cases. I've been to the Court of Appeals, been to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals a couple of times. That's where precedent gets set, right? So the trial court opinions, they have some precedential value, but it's the courts of appeal. It's the appellate courts that actually, those opinions are identified and used as precedent-setting cases. And I have been involved in a couple, one in particular, a police abuse case that was centered here in Yakima. And it dealt with arrest issues. And went to the Ninth Circuit, and yes, involved in that to the degree that it actually confirmed some existing law, and since that time period, it's been, more than 10 years ago now, has been abrogated, meaning not reversed, but it's been shifted. So the long answer to the short question is, yeah, I have been, but that's not really what I practice. That's not really my area of practice. My area of practice is in the courtroom, in the midst of these disputes, and then precedent is typically evolved, created, formed at the appellate court level, which is not the place that the trial lawyer really wants to be. Yeah, we want to get the dispute resolved to the best of our ability, hopefully in favor of our client in a trial, because that in and of itself is traumatic enough for people. Appellate courts, I think I waited. One appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Gosh, we were way over a year, maybe 2 years in, for finally getting, to the point where we're fully briefed, oral arguments before the court, and then a decision was handed out. And then once the decision handed down, there was a petition for certiorari to the Supreme Court of the United States, which you're thinking, some people go, it'd be great, let's go to the Supreme Court and argue a case. And for the trial lawyer, you're thinking, okay, here's another step that isn't getting resolution for my client, but may end up having some precedential value for someone down the road. And that matters. But ultimately, I want cases resolved for clients so they can move on. In the midst of a pandemic, the shortage of lawyers, right? There's a shortage of lawyers. And part of the reason there's a shortage of lawyers is because a lot of lawyers, there's a massive amount of fear. We're all the same creatures. I mean, if you think about it, fear drives us in such erratic, sporadic, crazy ways, right? And it's why it's so important for us to become fearless people. Not the absence of fear, but fearless, right? So that means you're experiencing chaos, stress in your life. Try to experience that a little less, a little fear less. And lawyers, they're funny creatures in the sense, not in a funny way, but in a very seriously funny way. They fear a lot. And people don't think that's true, right? Lawyers don't fear anything. They're angry, they're hostile, they're this or that. You come up with a million different descriptors of what a lawyer is, but they fear a lot. And during the pandemic, fear ran wild. And once that fear roots into the heart, right, it takes people over. And so I saw a lot of lawyers. There became a shortage of lawyers who were willing to reach out in the midst of this pandemic for fear that either they would die, they would get sick, they would die, or a person that they met with would get sick and die, or a family member would get sick and die. And it wasn't an irrational fear. I mean, there were people who got sick and died. But part of your job, I believe, as a lawyer, is you swear an oath that you're going to serve people. Okay? Now, what that means is sometimes you're going to put yourself in harm's way to serve another. And that's a really, really hard concept. It's so sweet and flowery to say when you take an oath in a calm, wonderful, peaceful world, but it's really difficult to implement when that oath to serve others has to play itself out in the midst of fear and chaos, right? So there were a lot of lawyers who were unwilling, and I think because of fear, unwilling to serve, and specifically serve others because of the fear of the fear that was caused by the pandemic, and also fearful of government entity. I mean, lots of lawyers, we're a law-abiding group, right? By and large, lawyers, we live and breathe the law. The government says you're going to do X, Y, Z. We're pretty much, we may be a little bit of resistors, but we're going to follow the law. And so there were a lot of folks who said, I'm not meeting with anybody. And I've heard stories from clients, right, that would come in and they would say, I've tried 50 different lawyers. I need some help. I don't know what my rights are in the midst of this chaos, in the midst of a pandemic. Nobody will meet with me. Nobody will actually sit down and tell me, what does the law say in terms of my rights as an employee or an employer? And I told people, I said, look, here's the way I operate. If you want to meet, I'm happy to meet with you. If you want to do that remotely, I will meet with you remotely. I will, if you want to wear a mask and take whatever safety precautions make you feel comfortable, I'm willing to do that. And I would continue to advise people in the midst, throughout the pandemic, of what the do's and don'ts and the rights they have, the responsibilities they have, and how to navigate what I think is navigate this world of chaos as best possible for everybody individually in terms of whatever questions they brought to me. And I think more lawyers at that point in time, it would have been good if more lawyers would have done that. And I know there are others that did. I'm not diminishing that there are folks who did continue to advise clients in the midst of that, but a lot didn't. And that's something that I think as a profession we need to look at. Because when you enter into the professional role of service to others, it comes at a cost to yourself and to your own preservation. And if lawyers don't, or if people don't want to do that, there are lots of occupations people can engage in that are not in at its core in service to others. So you don't have to do this profession, but if you're going to do this profession, that's the touchstone that matters even in the midst of a pandemic. That is service to others, which sometimes costs you something. I listened to a Supreme Court justice speak a few weeks ago about this, and it was a great reminder that there's a cost. There's a cost to yourself and sometimes to your family and to your relationships as you seek to serve others. It's not always a win-win for the lawyer. Sometimes there's a cost involved, and I think we need to remember that. The most noble thing that I saw from the legal profession during the pandemic absolutely centered around the courts, and this is near and dear to my heart, right? Because I'm a trial lawyer. The courts pivoted incredibly quickly, at least at the trial court level, to try to reorganize calendars and cases and the disputes people had so that they could still try to marshal through in the midst of that pandemic. Instead of shutting down, closing the doors and saying, we're not opening up for business for however long this takes, they didn't do that. They pivoted, and a lot of that goes to the judiciary, right? It also, which are lawyers, right? We make that claim. It also goes to the staff that work in the court system and their incredible willingness to stay the course and make our courts function, because if you shut our courts down, you shut justice down. You shut down democracy in a lot of ways, right? Because we are a rule of law country. And so if our legal system is not functioning, that's why I go back to the advice and lawyers meeting with clients and how incredibly significant that was for people to continue to do that. And I saw that being hampered, right? But the courts, I think, I'm very proud of our courts, right? And I'm not a judge, but I'm very proud of, and it was very noble, and it was very aspiring to see how they operated. A lot of folks will say, well, here's what makes a good judge. Let's poll. Let's do a poll, right? And who are we going to poll? Let's poll lawyers, right? Because they would be the ones that would best know how judges operate. Wrong answer. I don't think lawyers are the best gauges of whether a judge is a good judge or a bad judge or something in between. And the reason is because we're in the dispute resolution process, right? So I go up in front of his or her honor, and I get a ruling that's favorable to my client. I'm like, well, there's a great judge because they just agreed with me. I get a bad ruling. Oh, that's a bad judge because they didn't agree with me. I mean, obviously, if they were a good judge, they would have agreed with me. Wrong. 100% wrong. The best gauges of whether somebody is a good judge, potentially, or just flat out are a good judge, first and foremost, every time, where's their heart? Where's their heart? Okay? Because the good judge is going to have a heart for people. They're going to love people. And here's why I say that. To oversee disputes, some of them bitter disputes between people, you got to start with a lot of love for people. Because if you start with very little love for people and you're dealing with the disputes amongst them, you're going to become incredibly bitter incredibly quickly, and your decision making and your ability to guide people through that process is going to be harmed. So first and foremost, you want to vote for judges, right? And we here in Washington, we have this crazy system, right, where we vote for a lot of judges. And in a lot of places, it's appointments or merit systems or various things. But first and foremost, has the judge got a good heart? And that is, do they love people? And it's got to be evidenced. It's got to be evidenced in their action. Second, Second piece to what makes a good judge is strike this, and I'm going to get there's really three things. Oh, second thing is community involvement. If you're a good judge, good judges, I think they're actively involved in the communities in which they judge. And that really sort of dovetails and ties into the heart issue, but it shows and it's evidence that they care about their community. And here's the thing that I think is really difficult. I'm not a judge, but this is what I think is difficult: to be actively involved and caring and supportive of your community, but also having to maintain some isolation and distance because you're a judge. That's a difficult road to walk, because there's all kinds of potential conflicts and appearances of impropriety if you're friends with this person or that person and not this person, and then you're asked to judge cases, right? That becomes incredibly difficult. So I think being active in the community and balancing that appearance of fairness, but also being active and caring in your community. Number two, that's the number two. So heart, community connection. The other part is curiosity. Judges have to be curious, right? And it's a combination. It's curiosity and courage. They have to be really inquisitive and think about, because they're going to see a lot of difficult circumstances, and if they become so stuck and so set in how they view things, I don't think that makes for good relationships with people. And I think so being curious, but also courageous enough to make rulings that may be unpopular, that makes for a good judge. The last thing I would say is a absolute overwhelming adherence to rule of law. Okay? So if you take all those things, and rule of law, because we are a rule of law country, so that takes somebody that's pretty smart, somebody who's understanding, empathetic, and willing to follow the rules that are set out for all of us in a society. That makes for a high-level, wonderful judge. No, and I'm not announcing to be a judge, no. But here's what I know. We all have a role to play in this world, and especially in our community, in our country. We have a role to play with judges. And we are asked oftentimes to cast votes for judges. And so what I would just encourage people with regard to selection of judges, right? Look for the person with a great heart, somebody who's connected to the community, somebody who has courage and curiosity built into them, and somebody who is dedicated to adherence to rule of law. That package, when put together, gives us people who are wonderful decision makers. And I think we're blessed. We are blessed in this community. We are blessed in this community with incredible decision makers and very good judges and people who exhibit all of those characteristics. They exhibit all of those characteristics. So we are blessed beyond imagine in our community, and very thankful, very thankful. As an attorney who practices in that arena a lot, very thankful for that quality of judging. What advice do I give to people who, knowing what we know now in 2024, who are facing at some point in the future, an unknown pandemic sweeps through the world, and they're facing government shutdowns or lockdowns or mandates that dictate you're going to make changes in your life. I think the first thing, as an attorney, one, I would have to literally understand what the mandate is. I would have to understand the authority and where it comes from before I could even start to give people advice, right? That would be the first step as an attorney. But once you determined, if you were able to determine, is this a lawful use of authority or not, then you could advise people appropriately, right? You can't advise people to break the law, but you can advise people as to what the law is, right? To the very best of your ability. And there are times, and I've seen this, where the government breaks the law. And if anyone doesn't believe that, then they probably need to re-examine the world around us, right? How we respond to that, right? Because the government doesn't get it right. They're gonna, and I've heard presidents say these things. Well, this is what this legal scholar says, and this is what this legal scholar says, and there's a majority of the folks on this side of the issue, but you know what? We're going to roll the dice and we're going to try this side of the issue. Okay, that's actually not inappropriate. It's just taking the legal scholars and the evidence and the concepts that they're working with and picking a side. And politicians pick sides, right? They pick sides every day. And so sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. And you need the lawyers, people in the small towns and cities and big cities and little offices and big offices who are willing to analyze what's been done to determine if it was proper, lawful, or unlawful, right? And then give that advice to people. And if the government is acting unlawful, I don't have any problem telling clients. I do this frequently, certainly in my arena, in the police misconduct arena. What they did, they being the government or the government actor, is wrong. It was wrong, it was unlawful, and here's how we're going to have to try to fix it. And mostly fixes for me come through a legal battle in the court system because it's an absolute dispute. Here's what I don't know. I'm struggling to think with an instance where the government stepped up and said, hey, we made this decision and we blew it. We were wrong. I can't come up. I know it probably happened.
Would that be a settlement?
Well, no. Yeah, here settlements are not an admission of anybody doing anything wrong. It's an admission that we're going to resolve the dispute. That's the extent of it. And I've had lots of settlements, especially government entities. So cases, with police and law authority, legal authority folks that and TSA agents, a different litigation involving government use of authority in an improper way. And the case, ultimately, typically they resolve through settlement. When cases settle, nobody admits liability. It's basically the party saying, look, we've litigated this to the extent that we can litigate it. We want to control the resolution through settlement as opposed to trial. And if you can't do that, then you go to trial, and a whole nother set of decision makers get to decide how something resolves. It'd be the judge or a jury, right? Most folks decide they want to be the ones who decide how a case ends. So that's how settlement works. But it's pretty hard to get. I mean, there's a lot of things implied. If the government pays hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for something where a human was harmed, implicitly, folks are smart enough to go, well, I bet they did something wrong there. But the settlement agreement itself will say nobody's admitting fault or liability. That's very typical. But it's hard to get the government, and I'm not talking just about the federal government. I'm not talking about states or all government. All government is very difficult to get government once it's set a course and made mistakes. It's almost impossible to get them to stop, back up, go a different direction without litigation. And that right is so precious to human beings, because if you take that right away, and you see this a lot where people want to limit people's ability to file legal claims, lawsuits. They want to take that away because there's a lot of argument over frivolity, ridiculous things, right? You see, and I won't get into the facts of it, but the whole McDonald's coffee case was a big example that got used to say, look, we need to reform this legal system, and essentially at its core, let's be able to stop or limit people's ability to file legal lawsuits, right? When you do that as a society, the only losers are people, because people then don't have the rights to hold entities or certainly government accountable. And it's already difficult enough to hold government accountable, right? For instance, has our government currently, right? Our current government, today's government. Let's look at the federal level. Is it collaborative, cooperative, or is it divisive? I don't know. I look at the federal system right now and I say, I can't imagine it could be more divisive, right? The only way it's more divisive is if you put one political party in trenches in a field and another side of the political party in trenches in a field, and then they take up physical arms against each other. That's about the only way we can become more divisive than we are right now. That division at any level of government, divisiveness, only harms people. People. Doesn't harm the government. It's almost immune from its self-inflicted wounds. But people, real people, human beings, the people who pay the bills, who raise the children, who educate each other, who love and live in community together, we get hurt through division at political levels. And at some point, right, the people have to say, enough's enough. We're done with this division that's being spurred on at the levels of leadership, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. And when that happens, it often happens through the court system, right? If we can get there and stay alive long enough to fight that battle through. Here's the call to action today. Fear and division. Fear and division. That's a pandemic that's continuing to persist, and this is what we need to do. When we fear, let's fear less. When we see division, let's find unity. Let's move ourselves and our community forward in a way that changes the world for the better. As always, appreciate you being here with us, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.